Good morning out there, all you students of the Scripture. We're glad to have you with us this morning, and we are following the outline of the International Committee on Bible School Lessons. And this particular quarter is being is dealing with issues concerning people that God has called in one way or another to do various activities. First, we saw the judges in the book of Judges, and they were military leaders. Now we are looking at prophets in the Old Testament, and we have looked at Moses and we looked at Isaiah, and this morning we go to Jeremiah, one of the great prophets. There were three large prophetic books, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, and we'll be getting to Ezekiel soon. So this morning we focus on Jeremiah. Well, shall we get out our crying claws and weep a bit?
The weeping prophet, yes. I don't know that he boo-hooed.
Well, I'll tell you, he sure complained a lot.
But he did complain, yeah.
In fact, he did his dead level best to quit.
Yeah, that's true.
I quit. I resigned this position, and God said, I reject your...
Well, he did a pretty good job not taking the job in the first place, but God prevailed there as well.
Yeah. And one of the saddest things you read later on in the book, God says, you will not be allowed. I will not allow you to take a wife and to have children. Mm-hmm. So he was a man who was without the blessings of children and a family. Mm-hmm. And that was a tough part of his life. Mm-hmm. He had to face things all by himself, although he did have one very close friend, mm-hmm. and that friend was Baruch, the son of Berechiah, and we even have a signature of that man has been found on some clay bulla mm-hmm. as his signature, and he is called the scribe.
Right.
So it's Jeremiah and Baruch, and they even seem to have spent their last years together in Egypt.
Right.
Baruch went to Egypt with him
after the destruction of Jerusalem.
Oh yeah. Near the end of Jeremiah's life. So.
Well, a little more typically, the call story of Jeremiah comes in the first chapter. We had to wait till chapter 6 for Isaiah's call story.
But there are similarities between them.
There are, and we're going to see some similarities to the call story of Moses that we studied a couple weeks ago.
Yes.
Now, the call story comes in verse 4 of chapter 1, but we want to look at some of the important information that's given in those first three verses. The first thing it tells us is to identify his family. It says he's the son of Hilkiah, one of the priests at the town of Anathoth in the tribal region of Benjamin. Now, the northern tribes have already been taken off into and scattered about in a great deportation caused by the Assyrians.
Yes.
Back,
yes.
Almost 100 years before.
Yes,
80
that's right.
or so years before.
Yeah.
So, but Benjamin, being very close down there to Judah, kind of maintained its identity and was more or less merged into Judah.
In fact, Saul of Tarsus is remembered as being a Benjaminite.
Right. So
he even has the name of the greatest Benjaminite of them all, King Saul, way back yonder.
Mm-hmm. So the town of Anathoth is in Benjamin, but it's just 3 miles.
Just over the border.
Just north of Jerusalem, which sat on the northern border of Judah.
Yes.
So it's almost like a suburb of Jerusalem.
Yeah, right.
But in some ways it was a world away, because although Jeremiah is called that his family are among the priests, it doesn't say the priests who served in Jerusalem or the priests at the temple, the priest at Anathoth. What's the dynamic that's going on here?
Well, I just turned in my Bible back to 1 Kings chapter 2, and David has given instructions to Solomon and then died. And among the problems that Solomon faced was how to clean up some of the problems that David faced during his reign. Mm-hmm. And one of them had to do with who was going to be the next king. There was a son of David named Adonijah who had some support, mm-hmm. and there was Solomon who had the support of Nathan and Bathsheba. And David decided it was Solomon who was to follow him. Mm-hmm. But there was a priest who backed Adonijah, and that priest was named Abiathar. And he is then listed, and let me read just a couple of verses out of the actions of Solomon in cleaning up these problems that persisted from the time of David. Mm-hmm. And this is chapter 2 of 1 Kings, verse 26. And to Abiathar the priest, the king said, that's Solomon, "Go to Anathoth to your estate, for you deserve death. But I will not at this time put you to death, because you bore the ark of the Lord God before David my father, and because you shared in all the affliction of my father." So Solomon expelled Abiathar from being priest to the Lord, thus fulfilling the word of the Lord which he had spoken concerning the house of Eli in Shiloh. Abiathar was from the house of Eli.
Right. So it's possible that this family of priests living up in Anathoth are descendants of Abiathar, the banished priest from 300 years before during the time of Solomon.
They had long memories.
They had long memories.
Yes.
And so although they're from a priestly family, they don't function as priests and maybe still bore a little bit of the shame of that banishment of their priestly ancestor.
To me, it's interesting that Jeremiah goes to the entrance to the temple mm-hmm. to deliver the most powerful sermon he ever delivered, which mm-hmm. was the temple sermon, mm-hmm. which got him nearly killed.
Yeah.
Because it was so disliked. Yeah. He was considered to be a traitor, and it was no wonder he wanted to give up the prophetic calling. And we're going to see that God reassured him from the very beginning, "I'm going to be with you and protect you."
Yeah.
But don't worry about it.
But it seems like Jeremiah is not really welcome in the temple or in the royal court.
That's right.
And so he's kind of an outsider, even though he's from a priestly family.
He is, but eventually some of the last kings, now, one of the last kings hates his guts and wants to do him in. That's mm-hmm. Jehoiakim. Mm-hmm. But finally, the last king of Jerusalem, Zedekiah, really does take Jeremiah in. "Is there any word from the Lord? Can you tell me anything positive?" Mm-hmm. And Jeremiah is always, "No, I'm sorry. It's going to be bad for you and for Jerusalem."
Jeremiah's prophetic career, we learn from the opening verses, started during the time of Josiah. It says in the 13th year of the reign of Josiah. So we know pretty much when that is. That's around
627.
627.
Yes.
And Josiah was a good king, and the last really good king of the southern kingdom. So he began his career at a time when the worship of Yahweh was supported by the king.
It's one of these interesting situations that you have a good king, and then you have his house, mm-hmm. his family after mm-hmm. him, that it all falls apart. Yeah. And Josiah is a prime example of it. Uh-huh. But Josiah died an unhappy death. He was assassinated when he went up to north in order to deal with some foreign kings, and he was put to death in spite of the fact he was trying to be a good king, you know. Mm-hmm. And the kings who came after him were all his descendants.
So Jeremiah's prophetic career began during the time of this good king, but then it went on during the evil kings who followed him,
Yeah.
and even past the time of the final destruction of Jerusalem.
I
in
think, yes.
587 or so.
Yeah, and in the latter chapters of Jeremiah, and our those who watch our program, if you really want to see the interesting things that happened after the fall of Jerusalem, start reading in about chapter 35, 6 of Jeremiah's book, and read it all the way to the end. And it is really a sad, sad story.
So what we learn in general there is that he was kind of kidnapped from Jerusalem during the fall and was eventually taken down to Egypt, and he ended his life, we assume, in Egypt.
We even have some of his oracles delivered in Egypt. And for example, he places some stones under a pavement and then says, Nebuchadnezzar is going to invade Egypt and take it over and put his throne right on the spot. And then you guys who fled from Jerusalem, you're going to get it.
Okay.
And so, I mean, he's still prophesying. The sorrowful thing is that he spoke against Egypt his whole life and in favor of Babylon. He was taken to be a traitor. So where does he spend his last days? He and Baruch, his scribe friend, there they are in Egypt, still railing against Egypt.
So the opening 3 verses tell us who Jeremiah is, where he's from, and about the period of time in which he's ministering during the last days of the southern kingdom. Well, let me read the story of his call, which is the point of our lesson today. Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 4. The word of the Lord came to me, saying, Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations. Alas, sovereign Lord, I said, I don't know how to speak. I'm too young. But the Lord said to me, Don't say I'm too young. You must go to everyone I send you to and say whatever I command you. Don't be afraid of them, for I am with you and will rescue you, declares the Lord. Then the Lord reached out his hand and touched my mouth and said to me, I have put my words in your mouth. See, today I appoint you over nations and kingdoms to uproot and tear down, to destroy and overthrow, to build and to plant.
Yes. And now this is not the end of his call experience. It goes on, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes.
Yeah. Well, the intimate relationship between God and his prophet is described in verse 5 with a series of interesting verbs. First he says, I formed you. And this is
God speaking.
This is God speaking.
To Jeremiah, yes.
It's the kind of language that you would use of a clay pot or something like that. So I shaped you to make you the man that you are.
Yes.
And then he says, I knew you. And this is a verb that speaks of kind of an intimacy.
Intimacy.
Yeah, between God and the prophet.
It's not I knew about you.
Right.
I knew you.
The third verb then is I set you apart. What's the significance there?
Well, that comes from the verb to be holy. And of course, the concept of holiness in that part of the world is to be separated and given a special standing with someone, in this case with God, with a particular calling and expectation.
So I consecrated you, I sanctified you.
Yeah, it would be better.
Something like that.
It would be better.
And then the fourth verb is I appointed you as a prophet to the nations. So I shaped the person that you are. I've known you intimately. I consecrated you for a special task. And now I've appointed you to that task.
Well, and that verb is actually the verb to give. And that's even more intimate. I've given you.
So Jeremiah is God's gift to the nations, as it were, with his prophetic.
They may not understand that.
They may not like the gift.
They may not like what he has to say to them.
So, sometimes we tease about people thinking they're God's gift to humanity. But as it turns out, Jeremiah really was.
It really was. Now, the name for God in verse 6, the NIV translates sovereign Lord. The wording is actually Lord Yahweh.
Okay.
It's a combination of two names for God that have been put together. Adonai, which comes from the base word meaning Lord, and then Yahweh, the special covenant name we saw revealed to Moses way back in our lesson about Moses.
Okay. Now, it's at this point that Jeremiah immediately makes an excuse
Yes.
to try to say, well, I don't know if I want to be a prophet to the nations. And we've seen this in Moses, and we saw this in Isaiah. And I remember
I think all of the prophets feel that way.
You gave a wonderful list of all the excuses
Of Moses.
5 excuses you had found there. This looks like 2 separate excuses, but it's actually all part and parcel of the same excuse, don't you think? Yeah.
I'm inadequate.
Yeah.
And I'm inadequate because I don't know what the words to say, and I don't know how to speak to these people because I'm a lad.
Yeah.
Now, this word lad suggests he's probably a teenager. Exactly where in the teenage years, it's impossible to say, but he is not yet considered to be a mature individual, a man.
Yeah. Although the concept of youth could extend pretty far up to the time of marriageable age, couldn't it?
Yes, but marriageable age to them was lower than what we usually practice.
But the main complaint here is his ability to speak, and that makes sense that he would focus on that, because being a prophet is being a spokesperson for
Exactly,
God.
that's what prophets do.
Yeah, and we saw that Moses was focused on this same issue in his excuses and his complaint.
I can't speak well.
Right.
And God said to him, well, who made man's mouth?
Yeah.
You don't think I can take care of that problem?
But Moses didn't let it go at that. That didn't satisfy Moses.
No.
He came at God again, and that's when God said, okay, well then I'll give you Aaron. He's a better public speaker, evidently.
Aaron will be your prophet. You are going to be like a god to Pharaoh, and Aaron will be your prophet who speaks for you.
Yeah.
A very interesting concept for Moses.
So the language in verse 6 doesn't suggest 2 excuses. I don't know how to speak and I'm too young, so much as it does, I don't know how to speak well because I'm still so young.
Yes.
Okay.
That's a good way to understand it, I think.
God responds directly to that, to both of those complaints. In verse 7, don't say I'm too young, and then he gives his reassurance in verse 7, you must go everywhere I send you and say whatever I command.
Right.
Yeah.
Go and say and speak.
Go and speak, and those are that's the commission of every prophet.
Yes.
To go to a certain people group.
Right.
And to speak God's message to them.
Exactly.
And we saw that with Moses, we saw it with Isaiah. Who will go for us? Who shall we send?
Yes.
There's the idea of going.
Right.
And then here's the idea of speaking.
Now,
as well.
this is a very interesting statement in the next verse. Do not be afraid of them. And we know that in all of these prophetic books in the Old Testament, fear not becomes a way of indicating there is you're being given a hopeful word. The oracle is one of hope, so don't really give up here before you've even started. Fear not. For I will be with you. I am with you. And we've seen that before in what we've seen in previous lessons, that this is the surest and best thing that could happen to anyone, to have God say, I am with you in what you're doing.
Yeah. Beyond all of the gifts of God, all the empowerments of God, is the presence of God.
Yes.
That's promised.
And this is even identified as an oracle because what is translated as declares the Lord is actually, literally speaking, an oracle of Yahweh.
Okay.
This is an oracle of Yahweh. There's no higher authority than that.
Right. It's interesting. When I read these words in verse 8, I just can't keep from thinking about Mary, the mother of Jesus.
Exactly.
Who was given the words, "Fear not,
fear not.
The Lord is with you."
There's good news.
Yeah, the Lord is with you.
Now, with you,
part of the promise in verse 8 is that God will rescue you.
Yes.
And not rescue Israel or rescue Judah, but rescue you. And when we read the rest of the story of Jeremiah, we see that he needed a lot of rescue.
There were a lot of rescue stories. Yes.
Let's see. What are some of the things that Jeremiah faced? He was put in the stocks at one point, right?
Well, he was, I think the closest, the worst thing that came to him, he preached his temple sermon at the beginning of the reign of this King Jehoiakim. And it so infuriated the king that he dragged Jeremiah in and put him on trial for his life. And if it hadn't been for the intervention of some of the authorities of the tribe of Judah outside of Jerusalem, he would have died.
Yeah.
And he was rescued, you might say, right out of the mouth of death on that occasion. He was thrown into a cistern.
A cistern, yeah.
There was a lot of throwing of people in cisterns I've found in the Bible, especially in the book of Jeremiah.
It was
later on.
hard to escape from a cistern, I guess.
No way out, unless you had wings.
He had or a friend with a rope, as in the case of Ebed-Melech,
exactly.
His friend with a rope. So at any rate, we don't take this lightly, I will rescue you. Jeremiah literally needed to be rescued from many, many dangerous situations. Well, an interesting parallel to the call story of Isaiah comes in verse 9, where God reaches out and touches the mouth of the prophet.
In Isaiah's case, he complained that his lips were unclean, and the coal off the altar on his lips then cleansed his lips so that he could then speak truthfully and accurately the words of God.
Right.
Jeremiah is not complaining about his mouth being unclean, but he does in fact then receive this blessing. And he, in his own experience, and this may be a vision of some sort, he sees the hand of God come and touch him on the mouth.
Right, right. And so even though there's no sense of purification here, like there was with the live coal on the lips of Isaiah, the mouth symbolism amounts to the same thing in both ones, empowering their speech in behalf of God.
Right, exactly.
And then we get the wording of the commission itself in verse 10. See, today I appoint you over nations and kingdoms. And
nations, the word nations is a very important word here because I think the King James says Gentiles. And that's the point. Foreign nations and foreign kingdoms are implied here. So he will have oracles not only about the defunct northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, but he'll also have oracles about all of the other nations in the vicinity.
Yeah, and even though most of those oracles are negative, I would say that God, even God's holding foreign nations accountable, is evidence of God's care of all people.
Yes.
Care of those nations. He cares
Yeah.
that they have violated his will. And
Now
so he's reaching out.
Yes, and now there is a part that's not given here that we must refer to beginning in verse 11. There are two visions. Not only does the prophet hear, but he sees, as in the case of Isaiah. He sees these things.
So he's given two signs.
He's given two signs. What do you see? And he says, I see a rod of almond. Now, the word almond in Hebrew is shaked, and God says, okay, since you've seen that, what it means is I am watching over my word to perform it. And the word to watch over is shoked.
So there's a play on words between almond and watching.
Watching. And the second one is a pot boiling over, and it is boiling over facing the south. And this, God then identifies this as a sign of what Jeremiah has got to say. There is destruction like a pot boiling over coming from the north. And even though Babylon is east, Babylon will attack from the north because they have no way to go across the Arabian desert.
So the two signs remind us of God's watch care over the people, but also of a coming destruction.
Yes.
As well. And that's reminiscent of the last words in verse 10 in our printed text, which we haven't mentioned, to uproot and tear down, to destroy and overthrow, to build and to plant.
Yes.
Jeremiah's message was negative. It was about a coming invasion and destruction.
But not all negative.
Right. It was also positive that there would be a time of upbuilding and replanting, a little bit reminiscent of the positive part of Isaiah's call with that there will be a stump that remains.
Yeah, right.
And there'll be life that comes from that stump.
We can call it stump theology.
Remnant theology.
Yes.
The call story, which runs, as you say, on through chapter 1 of Jeremiah, ends with these wonderful words. Though they attack you, they will not prevail, for I shall be with you to keep you safe. This is the oracle of the Lord. It reiterates the promise that he was given in verse 8 of God's presence and God's rescue.
God never commissions a prophet without assuring that prophet that God will be with them through all their trials. But Jesus once said of the prophets, which one of the prophets did your fathers not persecute and kill?
Yeah.
Now, isn't it interesting that it sounds like two opposites, but they're not opposite, because God went with them through whatever they suffered, even to the end of their lives.
All right, so fear not.
And there's the lesson about Jeremiah. We didn't get him weeping very much. We didn't give him a chance to weep, but anyway, we've gotten the call of Jeremiah, and we see how God has called him and promised to be with him. Now, next week, we'll have another prophet and a prophetic call, and we look forward to that time of being with you. May God bless you this week.